I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at a kind of combination of programming and sort of DJ style whole track processing. What I've got within this project is a kind of promising groove which is playing out in the first 8 bars of my project. What I've then got is a couple of muted tracks which we're going to come to in a little while, and what I want to do is to kind of reimagine a section of the beginning of my track through a middle section before bringing it back in again at the end. So effectively we're going to take the listener on a journey through a version of the main part of the track, which by the way sounds like this. Okay, and this is where a new kick drum and a new loop are going to come in, and we'll hear those in a little while. So firstly, what I want to do when I refer to kind of DJ style processing, what do I mean? Well, when we're working in the studio and we've got separate instruments in every track, we've got the sort of capability to process any individual sound within our mix. DJs don't have that luxury. They have a series of tools at their disposal, all of which can process sounds in different ways, but of course the sounds they're processing are people's finished records, in other words, stereo mixes of whole pieces of music. They can't suddenly isolate just one individual instrument because it's part of a whole. And sometimes it can be a really instructive, interesting thing to do to apply the same process when we work in the studio. Yes, we've got access to every single sound, but sometimes really interesting, creative things happen when we just decide that we're going to commit or render a track, turn it into an audio file, and then see what happens when we process the whole thing as one. So to do that, what I'm actually going to do is I'm bearing in mind that this is the same 4-bar section that's happening twice. I'm going to select just this second group. Effectively what I want to do is to turn this into an audio file, and I'm going to choose the second half. So what I can do is to select all 5 of these tracks, and what I can then do is to bounce them in place, which I'm going to do by clicking on any of them whilst holding down the Control key, jumping down to bounce and join and selecting bounce in place. And because all 5 tracks are selected, effectively this means that all of them are going to be captured in this bounce. I'm going to just call this track, because it is going to be the whole track. I'll know that it's worked because I'll be able to see the waveform of all of the tracks together, but much more importantly, all of them will have been muted. So hopefully when I press play on this and just solo it, we'll hear the whole tune. Sure enough, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so what next? Well, I'm going to unsolo that, and I'm going to move it back into this section here. This is where I want to start breaking my track up and doing interesting things with it. Now, by default, what's happened is that because I selected this option at the bounce in place stage, all of the original parts have been muted up to that point. So I'm going to just reinstate them so I've got my first 8 bars back. So I've now got all of the tune that I had before, and now I've got a kind of chopped up version of it playing from bar 9 onwards. Okay, so what happens when we start having this kind of DJ style control? Well, for a start, we can start doing audio processing things that are much harder when we've got a combination of audio files and MIDI and those things triggering effects. Because effectively what I've done by capturing this group of 5 tracks as one stereo track is that everything's been captured. All of the effects, anything that's going on in any individual track. And sometimes when we start simply just chopping up MIDI regions and audio regions, we don't get what happens when we chop up an entire track. And we're going to explore some of those options right now. So the first thing I might choose to do, for instance, would be to say, okay, well, I'm only actually interested in a section of this rather than the entire track playing out with the entire chord progression. Maybe what I want to do is to go and see whether or not an interesting thing happens if I just select a really small area of this. So let's start by just taking the first 2 beats and see what that sounds like if I just put a loop around it. Okay, well that's nice actually. That might be an interesting place to start. So what I'm going to do is to chop this audio file right here on beat 3, and for now I'm going to throw that end of it away. Now I use that phrase, throwing it away. Actually, I haven't thrown it away at all. One great thing about audio within Logic is that effectively all I'm doing here is selecting a shorter part of the audio file. There's a difference between what we call an entire audio file, the entire audio part that I've rendered down, and then what we call a region, which is a section of that audio file. And if I ever want that back, I simply just need to open up the bottom right-hand corner and I'll get back to the full version of this track if I want it. So it's still available to me. But what I can do now is I can start just copying this section and putting it where I want it. So effectively what I'm in a position to do is to start copying it. Now, sometimes this happens, that effectively when you move an audio region along, suddenly it finds itself off the grid. And if you ever find yourself in this position, don't panic, don't worry. What you're in a position to do is just put this kind of copy somewhere else, move it down the road if you like, just put it somewhere, and if it's not conforming to the grid, remember you can just remove it and come back and start again. So what I'm going to do is to copy this a little bit more carefully this time and put it at beat 3, and then I'm in a position to sort of recreate the little cycle section that I had before, this time having actually copied the regions so that the track has an opportunity to play. But what I might also do would be to say, okay, well, be a bit boring just for this little bit of this region just to play all by itself the whole way through. So maybe what I'm going to do instead at this section is to make this just a beat long and repeat that instead. Let's just see what that happens over a couple of, what that sounds like over a couple of bars. So I'm coming out of the MIDI here, this sort of programmed version, and now we're getting into our kind of breakdown. So, okay, we've got a nice little bit of the groove happening there as well. The other thing I might decide to do would be to say, okay, well, actually, what might happen if I take a section of this and maybe I want to reverse it? Maybe I'm going to take this last little moment right here at the end of this, this bar here, and I want to take this last slice and reverse it. Well, the thing about audio within Logic, or indeed any workstation, is that in order to reverse it, I need to be a bit careful. Remember, this little bit of audio is being used in a number of different regions. If I reverse it, it will reverse in every single one of those regions because I'm making a permanent change to that audio file. So if I just want to reverse one individual sort of slice, what I need to do is to convert it into a new audio file. I'm going to do that by control clicking just this one individual piece, and then what I can do is to convert it to a new audio file. So that's within the convert options here. And when I do that, Logic's just going to say, fine, what do you want to call it? I'm going to call it reverse. And what will happen now is that I can see that even though it's the same color, has got a different file name, whereas everything else is track, because that's what I called my bounce. This little section is called reverse. What I might do is give it its own color, just so we can remember that that section is different. And what I can then do is to double click on this, open up the audio editor down here at the bottom, and then within the file option and then functions, I've got the opportunity to reverse it. So what I've done there is to click on this region, come into the file options, then into functions, I can then reverse it, and then that slice will reverse. And I can see that it's playing backwards. Let's see what that sounds like at the end of bar 10. Okay, so that's working nicely too. Now, of course, other things that DJs have at their disposal are the opportunity to trigger effects on tracks. And again, because they're working with stereo tracks, any effects they add in this way are going to affect the entire mix. And actually, Logic's got a couple of really interesting multi-effects which allow us to do different things with sections like this. And the advantage of that is that then we've effectively got an opportunity to bring in new track elements under this processed version. Now, what I'm going to do is to come down to the multi-effects folder, and the one that I'm interested in selecting is Phat FX, which is here. And what this is going to allow me to do is to do a number of different processes on this audio file. Now, a bit like step effects, what Phat FX allows you to do is to work in this modular way where you can look around the interface and decide which modules you want to bring to a sound. And by default, I can see that there's a bandpass filter, a distortion unit, modular effects, which are here. This one's currently off at the moment. There's a bass enhancer option, compression, and a separate filter up here as well. So I can go through and turn on the things that I want to use. Well, I quite like the idea of a little bit of distortion, so I'm going to leave that enabled. And what I want to do is to explore the bandpass filter options in particular. Now, what I can see is that there is an XY pad here. And what this is doing is mapping different parameters to this area where I can kind of play around with the playback of this sound. And I can see that the low cutoff and the high cutoff from the bandpass filter are the currently selected parameters. And what that means is that as I press play and start to move this little blue ball around this area, I'm going to hear changes to the bandpass filter. and that's working really nicely. So what I might choose to do in a moment is to automate this movement so that it becomes part of my track, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I want a longer section than just these 4 bars. I'm going to repeat this area that I've copied or chopped up so that it's copied into bar 13. And what I'm now going to do is to reintroduce these 2 slightly techier elements that I've brought into the project too. This is just a sort of techie kick drum, which is playing here. Let's have it, make sure that it's playing for the full 8-bar section. And then I've got a sort of top loop. So effectively we're getting into a kind of breakdown techier section of our track. And what we're going to do is to run it through bar 5 and begin to hear the kind of reimagined version of this track playing through this section. And what I'm going to do as I listen back is I'm going to engage latch mode, and I'm going to record some of that XY pad movement so that it becomes part of the track. Let's just make everything a little bit smaller so we can see it as it plays back. Okay, so that's nice. What I've now got is this movement that's happening here. And of course, what I could do would be to go into read mode there to protect that automation data. And then of course, I could take my first collection of tracks, bring them back over here at bar 17. And effectively now I've created this drop down section, which is then going to return into the main section of the tune. Now, of course, the one thing I would say is that having been into this kind of slightly deeper version of this tune at this stage, it feels quite light there at the end. So one thing I might choose to do would be to keep these 2 new elements playing through the development of the track from that point onwards, so that effectively these new elements that we've picked up in this middle section have a chance to be part of the evolution of the track. So within this video, we've looked at a number of different techniques. In particular, what we've done is to learn the benefits of bouncing in place a whole collection of sounds within our mix to turn them into an audio file. That immediately means that we can chop them up, reverse them, and do interesting things, finding little sections of a whole track and building a new section just out of a little slice, maybe, of a bit of that groove that sounds interesting. What we've then done is to build some new elements around that and begin to kind of add nuance and sort of drama almost really to the way that the track unfolds by adding this kind of Phat FX treatment where we're playing around with this bandpass filter treatment. And what we can do is to make musical decisions about how those effects are going to unfold, so that as we then move back into the main section of the track, we've effectively created this nice little journey to take our listener on. And lastly, what we've seen from an arrangement point of view is that we can take those elements in the drop section and have them become part of the development of the track afterwards.